Since man first conducted naval warfare with Ugg in his floaty log, he desired to gain an advantage over his enemy, leading him to invent weapons to not only extend his range, but also things like Greek fire in the Middle Ages, for example. But with the advent of gunpowder, the range extended even further. Over the coming centuries, advancements in guns, rangefinders, and other critical technologies led to battleships in the 20th century firing well over the horizon and hitting their targets. Now, in today's modern age, it's no surprise with missiles and drones. Still, during the Second World War, there was some very good gunnery with large caliber guns. And in today's video, we're going to look at a few examples, ones that I find interesting at least. Do put in the comments others you'd like to see. Now, I do want to give some context to each hit and describe the hit and battle in some detail, so bear with me. In early June 1940, there was quite a bit going on in Europe, with the successful German invasion of the Low Countries in France, not to mention the Allied evacuation at Dunkirk. Previously in the spring, the Germans invaded Denmark and Norway with varying degrees of success. A very difficult battle emerged with the Battle of Narvik and the various campaigns in the sea, air, and land. The initial capture of the Norwegian port city was hotly contested by an Allied counter-invasion that was eventually successful on the 27th of May. Because of the other events I previously mentioned, 10 days later, they were forced to evacuate, necessitating fleet carriers like HMS Royal or Glorious to assist in the evacuation, with Glorious ferrying aircraft stationed in Norway back to the United Kingdom. The orders for the operation to be carried out under the codename Juno by the battleship Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, and 4 destroyers were issued on May 29th. Zemke continues, "The first and main assignment was a surprise penetration into Vestfjord and Vagsfjord to Horstadt and destruction of the bases, transports, and warships found there. If reconnaissance reports showed that a sortie into Vestfjord and Oftofjord, possibly as far as Narvik, appeared to offer better prospects of success, that was to be carried out as the main assignment. The additional task, protection of supply transports from Trondheim to Bodo, could be carried out either simultaneously with the main assignment or after its execution. Trondheim was to be used as a base. The naval staff indicated that it was thinking not only of a single strike against a specific target, but also of continuing operations that would be carried out over a longer period. The order, as delivered to the commanding Admiral Fleet, Wilhelm Marschall, set specific missions. Still, in a verbal discussion with Marschall on May 31st, Reda couched the requirements in more general terms, which may have caused a serious divergence in views regarding the execution of the operation, which later developed between commanding Admiral Fleet and the naval staff. Where they had some decisions to make as we turn to the war diary of the battleship as found in battleships of the Scharnhorst class, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the backbone of the German surface forces at the outbreak of the war by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke. Conference fleet commander and commanders on flagship Gneisenau. For an attack on Horstadt and Vagsfjord, we still had no information on mine/net barriers, underwater obstructions, and shore torpedo and gun batteries. And that was not the only precondition for initiating the attack. The second precondition was satisfactory information based on air reconnaissance as to the types, extent, and situation of enemy naval forces in the fjord. Both preconditions had to be met in order to not run the risk of incurring the most serious losses. The destruction of loading wharves and land installations seems to me very questionable. Where are they? Will they be able to recognize them from the ship, and can we get at them? Finally, an attack of this kind ought to be mounted jointly with the Luftwaffe, and for this we require liaison and cooperation. It would appear from the current reports that all ship movements at the present time are westwards. Could that signify an evacuation? According to the subsequent situation report supplied by Admiral Norway on June 8, 1940, there were, in fact, no naval forces in the fjord. We might be therefore making just a stab in the dark. Fleet, therefore, proposed to attack the nearest escorted convoy within range. That was very much preferable to an unprepared blind thrust, which would have deprived us of the element of surprise in the event of a later raid on Horstadt. Essentially, Marschall and his commanders deduced that the British were evacuating Narvik and decided that the convoys offered valuable targets, something that the naval staff, upon hearing this at 5 a.m. on the 8th, did not necessarily agree with. telling Marschall his main assignment was still Horstadt. An attack by Hipper and the destroyers on the convoys was left to his discretion. Marschall still went through with his plans of attacking the convoys and soon would find success. The Hipper set course to intercept the merchant ship, which proved to be the transport Orama that carried only 100 German prisoners and was sunk with their signals being successfully jammed. The hospital ship Atlantis was not attacked. Shortly after 1 p.m., Marschall released the destroyers and Hipper to Trondheim for refueling and to take over the task of opening a route for supplies along the coast. Marschall took the 2 battleships to Horstadt in the Tromsø area, where radio intercepts detected the presence of 2 aircraft carriers. When before 5 p.m., the mastheads of a warship were sighted, which upon closer inspection turned out to be the carrier Glorious and her 2 escorting destroyers, Ardent and Acasta. Looking at an aircraft carrier with 2 destroyers, one north and south. These ships were HMS Glorious with the destroyers Acasta and Ardent. 5:21 hours, turn to steer 150 degrees, target now to port. 5:26 hours, speed 26 knots, steering 160 degrees. Secondary armament will take the destroyers north, Ardent. Opening range 14.5 kilometers. Bearing course for guns 120 degrees by bearing gauge. Aircraft carrier laying smokescreen. Open fire at the aircraft carrier. The main armament opened up at the aircraft carrier at a range of 26 kilometers by rangefinder. Lateral accuracy good, on target with 3rd salvo. That salvo at 5:32 is the one we will discuss, as you've heard and have hopefully read. Scharnhorst hit Glorious at approximately 26 kilometers, or for us who use imperial units, 15.9 miles or 28,500 yards, which, due to a German news crew being on board, we have quite the extensive collection of footage that details this operation and the sinking of Glorious. Some of you might have been furiously typing away that I got the range wrong. However, let's dig a little deeper. Taking from the excellent Vincent P. O'Hara in the German Fleet at War, 1939 to 1945, on Glorious, we find Bob McBride and others who witnessed the hit. As found in Carrier Glorious, The Life and Death of an Aircraft Carrier, Warships Battles of World War II. But there could be no possible doubt about that first 11-inch shell hit, which demolished McBride's Swordfish, penetrated the flight deck, and detonated inside the hangar. It seemed to Hellas to be almost above his head. The flight above us was wreathed in smoke, then tongues of flame. Then the staccato sounds of fire rose to a great roar, and a red wall like a living furnace rose from the hangar. The blast wrecked the Hurricanes. Somebody said to Cross, "Bad luck, your Hurricanes have copped it," and started a major fire in which exploding .303 ammunition, ricocheting off aircraft and bulkheads, added to the confusion. The CO and some of the pilots of the 802nd were also in the hangar. We had been so engrossed in our discussion that the first shock of the exploding shells barely registered until, in my case, I saw that my fitter had been hit in the chest with a largish heavy metal fragment of black smoking shell. He fell flat on his back on the hangar deck. He exclaimed, "Oh, my wife and children," and was dead before a move to assist him could be made. Glorious and her escorts fought valiantly, but were outmatched by the German guns and went down a short time later. Next up, we have Warspite's hit on Giulio Cesare. By June of 1940, when Italy joined the Second World War, Giulio Cesare was stationed in the main Italian naval base at Taranto, ready for action. Unlike the main Italian army in North Africa, which faced supply and logistics issues, ports like Tripoli, Benghazi, or Tobruk had not been properly readied for war, leading us to early July, when an important Italian convoy consisting of a passenger liner and 5 freighters loaded with a little over 2,000 men, tanks, vehicles, and critically 16,000 tons of fuel and supplies departed Naples and Catania for Benghazi on July 6th. Initially, only the 2nd Cruiser Squadron, the 10th Destroyer Squadron, and 6 torpedo boats had been allocated to escort the convoy. Once learning the British were putting out in force for a different reason, the Regia Marina put out with 2 battleships, the Conte di Cavour and Giulio Cesare, along with 6 light cruisers and 20 destroyers from Taranto, led by Vice Admiral Ennio Campioni, along with Vice Admiral Riccardo Palladini aboard his flagship Pola, his 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 16 destroyers from several bases in Sicily. After Mers el-Kabir, the British position in the Mediterranean was strained. To help strengthen it, the British intended to re-establish Malta as a major naval base, wherein it was decided to reduce the number of non-combatant servicemen and dependents on the island. These were to be removed in 2 small convoys. Admiral Andrew Cunningham was to interpose his Mediterranean fleet between these convoys and the likely route Italian surface forces would take. Simultaneously, Force H under James Somerville would create a diversion by raiding Cagliari in Sardinia. Cunningham left Alexandria late on the 7th of July. The front of his forces was Admiral Tovey's 5 light cruisers, followed by his flagship Warspite and 5 destroyers. Bringing up the rear was the slow group, comprising the battleships Malaya and Royal Sovereign, the carrier Eagle, and 10 more destroyers. The British were spotted on the 7th by an Italian submarine, and the following morning on the 8th, the British submarine Phoenix sighted the enemy main body, reporting it as midway between Italy and Benghazi, heading south. The convoy the Italian main body was protecting reached North Africa later, delivering the supplies. At 10 a.m., Italian aircraft flew out of the Dodecanese in Libya, subjecting Cunningham's fleet to a series of high-level bombing attacks, with 1 bomb hitting the light cruiser Gloucester and near misses damaging Warspite and Malaya. While at 3 p.m., the Italian main body turned eastward to meet the British as the British steered roughly northwest. Decoded British radio signals led the Italians to expect Cunningham off the Calabrian coast at noon on the 9th, with Mussolini ordering Campioni to postpone battle so the Regia Aeronautica could attack the British the next day. By 6:40, both Italian fleets, Palladini's cruisers and Campioni's battleships, were headed north-northwest. The morning of the 9th at 7:32 a.m., Sunderlands from Malta found Campioni's fleet and tracked him for nearly 4 hours. It gave enough time for Eagle to launch an airstrike, but not until 1:15 p.m. did a group of 9 swordfish who found Palladini's cruisers launch torpedoes at those cruisers, which all missed. The sight of carrier planes told Campioni that British warships were nearby. His cruisers launched 6 more float planes, one of which located the British 80 miles away to the northeast. Campioni, who had maneuvered his forces around, began to reverse course back to engage the enemy, where at 1:10 p.m. he received instructions concerning the engagement, and from Ermino Bagnesco and Agosto de Toro, an Italian heavy cruisers from Trento to Bolzano. Meanwhile, at 1:10, instructions had arrived from Supermarina concerning the criteria to be followed in any encounter. Not to distance themselves too far from aeronaval bases, to allow preemptive or contemporaneous air attacks, to engage, if possible, the enemy battleships separately, being aware of the different speeds, delaying surface contact to allow the Air Force to do damage to the enemy, to withdraw the battleships at sunset, to engage the torpedo craft at night. Cunningham headed northwest until 2:15 p.m. when satisfied he had positioned himself in between Campioni and Taranto, his ships steaming in the 3 groups I mentioned previously, with Tovey's light cruisers first spotting smoke on the horizon a half an hour later at 2:47. Gloucester had been sent to support Eagle, leaving a limited amount of cruisers. The range closed rapidly, with Tovey first turning away from the engagement as more smoke came over the horizon. Then, at 3:20, Tovey was ordered to engage, and the British cruisers with less than 50% ammunition began engaging the advance line of Italian cruisers. The gunnery of the Italian light cruisers was very good, hitting their targets. It wasn't long after when Warspite entered the battle at 3:24, targeting the now fleeing Italian cruisers. Meanwhile, when Campioni heard of the engagement, he swung his battleships and heavy cruisers towards the British position to hopefully catch them. This initial engagement broke off when the British also turned in the other direction. All the while, Warspite fired another 6 salvos at the enemy cruisers as the time passed to 3:30. Cunningham had no intention of fighting both Italian dreadnoughts with only Tovey as support, signaling Tovey to not get too far ahead of him. Meanwhile, Campioni steamed ahead, followed by the Italian light cruiser division, who had just been engaging the British. Campioni later praised the commander's conduct. He duplicated exactly what we had executed during our frequent peacetime tactical exercises, did not expose him to 381mm 15-inch gunfire after he was certain our large ships were heading towards the enemy, and succeeded in withdrawing his ships quickly and brilliantly from the line of fire. The shooting faded away between 3:36 and 3:48 as the Italians advanced and the British regrouped. By 3:40, Campione's battleships turned north-northeast, steaming at 24 knots, their top gunnery speed. Palladini's 6 heavy cruisers had reached a point 7,500 yards ahead of Giulio Cesare. By 3:50, Tovy's light cruisers steered west-northwest, 13,000 yards ahead of the now oncoming British capital ships as Malaya and Royal Sovereign had come up, but the Royal Sovereign lagged behind Warspite by a considerable margin. At 3:52, Cesare sounded off with their 12.6-inch guns, sending their 1,157-pound shells towards Warspite, quickly followed by Cavour targeting Malaya. Warspite began replying while Malaya was not in range, and the Royal Sovereign strained her engines to get into the fight. To take from the struggle for the Middle Sea, the Great Navies at War in the Mediterranean Theater 1940 to 1945 by Vincent P. O'Hara, who writes, "The Italian gunners fired deliberately, observing the fall of each salvo and correcting as required. Some Italian overs landed amid the British destroyers. Splinters sliced into Hereward and decoy, while some heavy rounds straddled Nubian twice." Her report noted, the second time, 2 shells fell within 10 yards over. 1 shell grazed the starboard strut of the foremast abreast the steaming light. While the battleships duked it out, Palladini steered to close with the British, taking his cruisers to fire both on Warspite and Tovy's cruisers. Both sides were shooting well, with Warspite being straddled by Cesare. Fearing that she had found her range, Warspite altered course 20 degrees to port and increased her speed, temporarily ceasing fire. As Italian lookouts guessed that Warspite had finally been hit and steering out of line, Cesare was hit at 26,000 yards, or almost 24 kilometers by Warspite's last salvo, being one of the longest ranged hits in the history of combat, plowing into Cesare's aft funnel. Taking from Italian battleships Conte di Cavour and Duilio classes 1911 to 1956 by Ermino Bagnesco and Augusto de Toro, they write, "Meanwhile, the most important development of the day had occurred. The fire of the Italian battleships had proven to be moderately accurate, even with rounds that straddled the target but that were somewhat dispersed. Only a few rounds fell dangerously close to Warspite's bow, and fragments from a couple overs damaged the destroyer's decoy and Hereward. Fire from Warspite was repeatedly well aimed, with salvos that were well grouped, and at 3:59, a shell hit Cesare on the after funnel. A violent fire ensued on the upper decks and superstructure and spaces 4, 5, 6, and 7, which had to be evacuated, and the boilers banked. Speed fell to 18 knots, and as a result, the Cesare fell astern of the Cavour. Campione, not knowing how badly his flagship had been hit, and with the prospect of facing the enemy with only one effective battleship, he ordered his battle line to turn away. This turn came at an opportune time for the British, as Tovy and his cruisers feared the worst as Palladini was pulling ahead. Both Cesare and Cavour pulled away and fired at a rapid rate until 4:08. Palladini's heavy cruisers continued to engage the British, but once Warspite and the other battleships turned to face the Italian heavy cruisers, Palladini retreated and the engagement came to a close later that evening. Now, what kind of damage did Cesare receive from Warspite? We can dig into the damage a little bit more than Glorious, as Giulio Cesare would survive until the 1950s when she was sunk by a German mine in Sevastopol while serving as the Soviet flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. Link in the description for that odd story. Again, taking from Bagnesco and de Toro, at 3:59, the Giulio Cesare was hit by a 381mm 15-inch round from the battleship Warspite at a very high plunging angle given the range of 24,000 meters. The round struck the aft funnel on the starboard side at the height of the second handrail and exploded, exiting from the base of the funnel itself. The head of the shell, which took a downward path, penetrated the forecastle between the forward frames 0 and 1 at 5.5 meters from the port bulkhead through the casemate, causing charges in the standby lockers of number 4 120mm 50 caliber turret to catch fire, penetrated the upper deck, and the bulkhead at forward frame 4, penetrated the mixed petty officers' quarters, petty officers of different departments, on the first lower deck, and came to rest against the inner face on the port side armor 120mm between forward frames 4 and 5 after having broken through the backing plating and wooden cushion. On the forecastle deck, the blaze generated by the burning of the standby charges vented through the entry hole made by the head of the shell, which set fire to the individual life preservers lashed to the guardrails, and the heat caused the ammunition stored in the lockers of number 4 37mm 54 caliber gun mounting to explode. The fires caused by the combustion of the number 4 medium gun turret charge lockers were fed by the embers, mats, and wooden materials spreading throughout the portside casemate and spread further to the starboard side. Flames and gases made their way to the numbers 2 and 4 medium gun turret through casing injection ports and elevator openings. The fires did not cause excessive concern to the staff captain and the head of the damage control, as the involved areas were not vital and which were quickly limited. All of this damage was captured thanks to Italian film crews on board Giulio Cesare. How interesting that 2 of the longest range hits in history were captured on film. I know there are plenty of long-range hits out there, I just found these to be the most interesting, mostly because of the filming of the events. But do let me know what other long-range hits you'd like to see in the future. Anyway, thank you for watching everyone, I hope you found it interesting, and do remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time my friends, have a great week.